My name doesn't matter. My tribe doesn't matter. If I tell you those things, the government will find me, will find my people, and what little protection our sovereignty provides will disappear overnight. What matters is that I'm 79 years old, I'm dying of liver failure, and I need to tell this story before it dies with me. Before the truth is buried along with the last person who witnessed what happened in the winter of 2006. Our tribe, a small Pacific Northwest nation you've never heard of because we've worked very hard to stay unknown, took in a dying Bigfoot, gave him shelter in our ceremonial lodge, cared for him in his final weeks. And in that time, as he lay dying from wounds we couldn't heal, he told us things about the United States government that we wish we didn't know. Things that explained why his people hide, why they fear humans more than any predator, why they've watched our government commit atrocities that never made it into history books because the victims weren't considered human under U.S. law. What he told us was so horrifying that our tribal council voted unanimously to never speak of it publicly. To protect the secret, to protect his people from the attention that truth would bring. But I'm old now, dying, and I've decided that some truths are more important than protection, that someone outside our tribe needs to know what the U.S. government has been doing in the deep wilderness for 70 years, what they've done to beings they don't consider persons, what they'll do to my people if they ever find out we sheltered one of them. It was January 2006, brutal winter. 3 feet of snow on the ground, temperatures well below zero, the kind of cold that kills if you're not prepared. One of our hunters, I'll call him Joseph, though that's not his name, was checking trap lines in the deep forest miles from the nearest road when he found tracks, enormous tracks, bipedal, recent, leading away from what looked like a kill site, blood in the snow, drag marks, signs of a struggle. Joseph knew what made those tracks. Our people have always known. We have words for them in our language. We have protocols for encountering them. We have agreements, unspoken but understood, about sharing territory. So Joseph followed the tracks, not to hunt, to help if help was needed. He found him 2 miles from the kill site, collapsed in a small cave, barely conscious. The being was massive. Joseph estimated 8.5 feet tall, maybe 700 pounds, covered in dark fur that was matted with blood and ice. His left side was shredded, deep lacerations, bullet wounds, burns that looked like they'd been caused by something other than fire. Chemical burns, Joseph thought, though he couldn't be sure. The being was dying. That was clear. The wounds were too extensive, the blood loss too severe. But his eyes were open, aware, intelligent. And when Joseph approached, the being made a sound, not aggressive, more like a plea, a request. "Help me." Joseph ran back to the reservation, called an emergency council meeting, explained what he'd found. There was debate, long, heated debate about whether we should help, whether we should call authorities, whether we should stay out of it. Our people have learned the hard way that getting involved in anything the government might care about is dangerous. We've lost land, lost rights, lost people to government interference disguised as help. But our eldest, a woman named Margaret, who was 93 at the time and has since passed, made the argument that 1, he came to our territory to die. He didn't go to the whites. He came to us. That means something. That means he trusts us more than he trusts them. We honor that trust, or we are no better than the people who've broken every promise they ever made to us. So we helped, organized a team, brought a sled, blankets, medical supplies, went back to that cave and brought him to the reservation, to our ceremonial lodge, the most sacred building we have, the place where we hold our most important rituals. We cleared it out, made it warm, made it safe, and we brought him there to die with dignity rather than alone in a frozen cave. He lived for 3 weeks, 3 weeks during which we cared for him, tried to make him comfortable, tried to understand what had happened to him. He couldn't speak much at first. The pain was too intense, the injuries too severe. But as we treated him with traditional medicines, as we sat with him through the long nights, as we made it clear we weren't there to hurt him or exploit him or turn him over to anyone, he began to trust us, began to try to communicate. He couldn't speak our language or English fluently, But he could manage some words, could gesture, could make sounds that carried meaning if you paid attention. And slowly, over those 3 weeks, he told us his story. Not all of it. He was dying, fading in and out of consciousness, struggling with pain we couldn't fully manage. But enough. Enough to understand what had happened to him. Enough to understand what happens to his people when the government finds them. He'd been captured, held for 11 years in a government facility, studied, experimented on. Tortured would not be too strong a word, though he didn't use that word. He just described what they did. The tests, the surgeries, the chemicals they injected, the ways they tried to break his will, his spirit, his mind. They wanted to understand him, wanted to know how his species' biology worked, wanted to know if they could be controlled, weaponized, used. He was one of many, had been held with others of his kind, had watched some of them die from the experiments, had watched others lose themselves, go mad from captivity and trauma, had endured things that would have killed a human. And then, in late 2005, there was a fire, an accident. Something went wrong with the facility's electrical system. In the chaos, in the smoke and confusion, he escaped. Badly burned, shot multiple times by security as he fled, but he escaped, ran for hundreds of miles, avoided roads, avoided people, avoided anything human, made it back to the deep wilderness, made it to our territory, made it to the place where he'd been born 80 years earlier, before the government knew his people existed in numbers worth hunting. He came home to die, and he wanted someone to know, wanted someone to understand what the government does to beings they discover but don't legally recognize as persons. Wanted us to know so we could protect his people, so we could keep the secret, so we could make sure no one else suffered what he suffered. What he told us about that facility, about what the government does, about the program that's been running since the 1950s. It's the most horrifying thing I've ever heard. And I've lived through a lot. I've seen what the government does to indigenous people. I've experienced boarding schools and forced relocation and broken treaties. But what they did to him, what they're still doing to any of his people they can catch, it's worse. Because at least we're legally recognized as human. We have some rights even if they're violated constantly. His people have none, are classified as animals, can be captured, experimented on, killed, and it's not murder. It's research, it's national security, it's legal. Before he died, he made us promise to protect his people's secrecy, promise to warn them if we ever saw government activity in our territory, promise to remember, promise to tell the truth someday, when it might matter, when it might help. I'm keeping that promise now, while I still can, before the cancer or the government silences me. He told us his story in fragments over those 3 weeks, pieces shared during moments of lucidity between the pain and the fever and the slow shutdown of his body. Our people took turns sitting with him, listening, recording what he said in our memories because we didn't dare write it down, didn't dare create physical evidence that could be seized or subpoenaed. We just listened and remembered, passed the information to each other so it wouldn't be lost if any one person died. His name, or the closest approximation our language could make, was something like Kahatsi. It meant one who watches, in his people's tongue, which he taught us fragments of, enough that we could understand some of their concepts even if we couldn't speak their language. He'd been born in these mountains in the 1920s. His people had been here for thousands of years, had watched humans arrive, spread, change the landscape, had adapted by hiding more carefully, moving to more remote areas, becoming excellent at invisibility. We knew to hide from the Europeans early, and he told us, watched what they did to the peoples who were here first, your peoples, saw the killing, the treaties broken, the removal, the boarding schools, the way they treated beings they saw as obstacles. We understood. We stay hidden, or we end up like that, dead or broken, or scattered. So we became very, very good at not being found. But in 1994, he made a mistake. He'd been gathering plants for medicine in an area he'd thought was safe, deep wilderness far from human trails. But logging companies had pushed roads deeper than he'd known, had opened areas that were supposed to be protected, and a logging crew saw him. Not clearly, just a glimpse through trees. But enough. They reported it, called it in to authorities, described something that wasn't a bear, wasn't normal, wasn't explainable. "I should have run farther that day," he said, his voice weak with pain and regret. "Should have understood that humans with machines could follow faster than I could hide. But I was old, tired, thought I'd lost them. I was wrong." The hunting party that came wasn't wildlife officials or local police. It was military, special unit. They'd been mobilized within hours of the sighting, too fast for a normal response, suggesting they'd been waiting for exactly this kind of report. They had thermal imaging, helicopters, tranquilizer weapons, protocols. They knew what they were hunting because they'd hunted his kind before. They found him 2 days later, shot him with tranquilizers, multiple darts, massive doses. He remembered going down, remembered the helicopter, remembered waking up in a cell, restrained, with humans in protective gear examining him like he was a specimen rather than a person. The facility was underground. He never saw sunlight for 11 years, never saw the sky, just artificial light and concrete walls and the smell of disinfectant that burned his sensitive nose. The cell was maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, barely large enough for him to stand upright, not large enough to lie down comfortably. Cameras watched constantly. Microphones recorded every sound. They studied everything, his vocalizations, his movements, his reactions to stimuli. The first year was tests, he said, blood draws, tissue samples, scanning my body with machines, measuring everything, documenting everything. They treated me like your people treat laboratory animals. Like I was a thing to understand, not a person to know. They spoke around me but never to me, never asked permission, never explained, just took what they wanted. He described the researchers, usually 3 or 4 at a time, wearing protective equipment, speaking medical terminology he didn't understand. They seemed to think he was intelligent but not sapient. Smart like a chimpanzee maybe, but not a person. Definitely not deserving of rights or consideration. Just valuable data waiting to be extracted. Year 2, the experiments intensified. They wanted to understand his biology, his immune system, his strength, his healing capabilities. So they wounded him, controlled injuries to watch how he healed, introduced pathogens to watch how his immune system responded, stressed him physically to measure his limits, all documented, all recorded, all framed as research, not torture, though the distinction meant nothing to the being suffering through it. They were trying to understand if my people could be useful, he explained. Useful to the military. Could we survive conditions humans couldn't? Could we be controlled, trained, weaponized? They tested drugs on me, things that were supposed to make me compliant, aggressive, suggestible. Most didn't work. Our biology too different. But they kept trying, kept adjusting dosages, kept looking for the combination that would let them control us. He wasn't alone. That was almost worse. Knowing others of his kind were there. He could hear them sometimes through the ventilation system, vocalizations that were distress calls, grief sounds, sometimes silence that was worse than sound because it meant someone had given up or died. He counted 5 distinct voices over the years, but never saw the others. They were kept isolated, studied individually, prevented from communicating or coordinating or providing comfort to each other. They were afraid we'd organize him, he said, afraid that if we worked together we might escape. They were right to be afraid, but they were also smart enough to prevent it, kept us separate, kept us weak, made sure we knew we were powerless. The security was extensive. Guards with weapons, not tranquilizers but lethal firearms, suggesting they were authorized to kill if necessary. Electronic locks, reinforced cells. Protocols for moving him. Always sedated, always restrained, always monitored. They'd clearly done this before. Had refined the procedures over years or decades. This wasn't experimental captivity. This was systematic, practiced, perfected through repetition. In year 5, they brought in new researchers. military intelligence types rather than scientists. They were interested in different things: his cognitive abilities, his communication, whether he could be interrogated effectively. They tried to teach him English, not to be kind, to see if he could learn human language, whether his intelligence was comparable to human intelligence, whether communication was possible. He learned, pretended he learned slower than he did, pretended he understood less than he understood, used their underestimation of him as the only weapon he had, the ability to gather information while they thought he was just a smart animal struggling with language. "I listened to everything," he said, "remembered everything, learned about the program, about other facilities, about how many of my people they'd captured over the decades, about what happened to the ones who didn't survive. They didn't know I understood, thought I was just mimicking sounds. But I understood. I knew. And I waited for a chance that I thought would never come. The chance came in 2005. A fire. Equipment malfunction. Chaos. His cell door failed to lock during the evacuation, and he made a choice: die trying to escape or die slowly in captivity. He chose escape, fought his way through smoke and confusion, killed 2 guards, broke their necks, didn't have time for remorse or gentleness, made it to the surface, made it to the forest, made it away, but not without cost. The burns, the bullets, the damage that would eventually kill him. He'd traded life in captivity for a chance to die free, and he considered it a fair trade. As Kahatsi's condition worsened, as he grew weaker and closer to death, he focused less on his own suffering and more on making sure we understood the full scope of what he'd discovered during his captivity. He'd listened for 11 years, learned about the program that had captured him, about its history and scope and purpose, about what the U.S. government has been doing to his people since the 1950s. The program has a name, he told us. Project Nightfall, started in 1952. Not because they discovered us. Humans have always known we exist, your peoples have always known. But because after World War II, after seeing what could be done with biological research and military applications, someone in the government decided we were worth studying, worth catching, worth exploiting for potential military advantage. The premise was simple: if Bigfoot exists, if they have unusual physical capabilities, if they've survived in extreme conditions for thousands of years while avoiding human detection, then they have traits worth understanding and potentially replicating. Strength, endurance, stealth, disease resistance, all valuable for creating better soldiers, better survival protocols, better biological weapons or defenses. The moral questions, whether it was right to capture intelligent beings without consent, whether they deserved rights, whether research on them was ethically defensible, were dismissed. They weren't legally human, therefore normal ethical guidelines didn't apply. They caught the first one in Montana in 1952, Kahatsi said. Young female. She survived 3 years before dying in captivity. They learned from that experience, built better facilities, developed better capture techniques, refined their protocols. And they've been operating continuously since then, capturing my people when opportunities arise, studying them until they die, then capturing more. He estimated they'd captured at least 40 of his people over 70 years. Not all at once. There was never a mass roundup, just opportunistic captures. Anytime one of his people was spotted, anytime there was a credible sighting that could be verified, teams mobilized. Used whatever story was necessary: wildlife research, national security, classified military exercises, closed off areas, brought in specialists, hunted until they caught who they were hunting, or until the target escaped. Most captures didn't result in long-term survival. The stress of captivity, the trauma of capture, the biological incompatibilities with captive conditions, most died within a year. A few, like Kahatsi, survived longer, adapted, learned to endure, but survival in captivity wasn't mercy. It was prolonged suffering, extended exploitation, more data extracted before death ended the experiment. The researchers don't see it as cruelty, he said. They see it as necessary work, valuable research. They tell themselves they're advancing science, protecting national security, contributing to human knowledge. They've created a framework where torturing non-human intelligence is acceptable, where capturing and studying us against our will is justified, where our suffering doesn't count because we're not classified as persons under the law. The facilities were scattered, at least 3 that he knew of, maybe more. Underground bunkers, remote military installations, places with sufficient security to keep subjects contained and sufficient isolation to keep the program secret. Operated by military personnel with specialized training, overseen by defense contractors and research institutions that had long-standing relationships with the Department of Defense, funded through black budget programs that didn't require public disclosure or congressional oversight beyond a handful of cleared committee members. Your government is good at keeping secrets, Kahatsi said, especially secrets about things the public would object to if they knew. So they classify, they compartmentalize, they make sure no one person knows the full scope, and they justify it as protecting national security, as if studying captured intelligent beings is somehow necessary for defending your nation. He described the legal framework they'd created to justify the program. Since his species wasn't legally recognized as human, they weren't protected by human rights law. Since they weren't classified as endangered species, couldn't be, because admitting they existed would require public disclosure. They weren't protected by conservation law. Since they were captured on federal or military land, normal animal cruelty laws didn't apply. They'd created a legal void where his people had no rights, no protections, no recourse, where anything done to them was technically legal, because no law specifically prohibited it. They discussed this in front of me, he said. Talked about the legal protections they had, about how the program could continue indefinitely because there was no legal mechanism to challenge it, about how even if someone did find out and object, the classification would prevent any meaningful oversight or investigation. They'd built a system that was legally invulnerable, morally bankrupt but legally protected. The worst part, he said, was knowing that the program would continue, that his escape, his story, his death wouldn't end it. They'd replace him, capture another of his people, continue the research, continue the exploitation, continue treating intelligent beings as government property to be used and discarded. The cycle would repeat until either his species went extinct or the program was somehow exposed and shut down. And he had no faith in the second option happening. Your people don't care about suffering they don't see, he said. Don't care about injustice happening to beings you don't recognize as persons. You have empathy for cute animals, for pets, for species you've decided deserve protection. But for beings like us, for beings that are strange and hidden and different, we're monsters in your stories. Creatures to be feared or conquered, not persons deserving rights. So even if someone told your public what the government does to us, I don't think most humans would care, would think it's justified, would prioritize national security over our suffering. He was probably right. I've thought about this constantly in the 18 years since he died. Thought about whether revealing the truth would matter, whether people would care, whether the program could be stopped. And I've concluded that most people wouldn't care enough, would find reasons to justify it, would say national security requires hard choices, would say they're not really people so it's not really wrong, would prioritize comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable action. But some people would care. Some people understand that intelligence deserves respect regardless of species, that consciousness deserves protection, that causing suffering to sapient beings is wrong even when it's legal. Those people need to know, need to understand what their government does with their tax dollars in their name, behind classification walls that prevent oversight. Kahatsi told us about the others he'd heard during his captivity. 5 distinct voices over 11 years. He didn't know their names, couldn't communicate with them, but he heard their suffering, heard them calling out in distress, heard them fall silent one by one as they died or were killed or simply gave up. Each voice that went silent was a person who died in captivity, a person whose life was taken for research, a person whose suffering contributed to classified papers that justified more captures, more research, more exploitation. Remember their voices, he told us, even if you can't tell anyone who they were, even if you can't prove they existed. Remember that they suffered, that they died alone in government facilities, that they were people who deserved better than to be treated as research subjects. Remember for me. Remember for them. Don't let us be erased from history as if we never existed. We've remembered. For 18 years, our tribe has carried this knowledge, carried the burden of knowing what the government does, carried the responsibility to protect his people's secrecy, because exposure means more captures, more suffering, more deaths. We've watched for government activity in our territory, warned his people when we could, leaving signs they'd recognize, keeping watch, providing early warning when helicopters or unusual vehicles appeared. And now I'm breaking that silence. Because protecting secrecy enables the program to continue. Because silence is complicity. Because someone outside our tribe needs to know. Kahatsi died on February 3, 2006. 22 days after Joseph found him. 22 days during which our tribe did everything we could to make him comfortable, to ease his pain, to give him the dignity he'd been denied for 11 years. We performed ceremonies, sang healing songs, sat with him so he was never alone, listened to his stories, honored him as a person despite our government's refusal to do the same. Near the end, when the pain was constant and his breathing was labored, he told us what he wanted. Wanted to be buried in traditional ways. Not our traditions, but his people's traditions as he described them. Wanted his body placed in a hidden location where the government would never find it. Wanted no marker, no memorial, nothing that could be discovered. Wanted to disappear completely so the government couldn't study his body even in death. Couldn't extract DNA or tissue samples. Couldn't add his remains to their research database. They'll come looking, he warned us. They know I escaped, know I was wounded. They'll search. They'll use satellites, helicopters, ground teams. They'll look for thermal signatures, signs of death, anything that leads them to my body. If they find me, even dead, they'll take me back, cut me open, study me, use my death to gather more data. Don't let them have me. Please, let me stay buried. Let me stay free. We promised, and we've kept that promise. His burial location is known to only 3 people now, down from the 10 who helped bury him. As those who know die off, the location will die with them. Eventually, no one will know where he's buried. He'll be truly lost, truly free from any possibility of discovery. That's what he wanted. That's what we gave him. But before he died, he told us the most horrifying thing. The thing that made us understand why his people live in such fear, why they go to extraordinary lengths to avoid all human contact, why they've developed protocols passed down through generations about hiding from our species. He told us what happens to the bodies of his people who die in government custody. They don't bury us, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Don't treat us with dignity even in death. They dissect us, completely, take every organ, every tissue sample, every piece of biological material, preserve it, study it, store it in facilities you've never heard of. They've been doing this since the 1950s, building a database of my people's biology. Every individual they capture, every body they recover, adds to that database. He described a storage facility he'd overheard researchers discussing. Climate-controlled, underground, containing preserved specimens, organs, tissues, whole bodies in some cases, of every individual his species they'd ever captured or killed. A grotesque museum of dead persons that the government refused to acknowledge as persons. A collection of evidence of crimes that weren't legally crimes because the victims weren't legally people. And they use it, he said. Use the tissue samples to try to replicate our biology. To understand what makes us strong, resilient, able to survive conditions humans can't. They want to create better soldiers, better survival capabilities, maybe clone us someday if the technology allows. They see us as biological resources, as materials to exploit, not as people who lived and loved and suffered and died. The researchers had discussed all this in front of him, thinking he couldn't fully understand, thinking he was just a smart animal that had learned a few English words. But he understood everything. Understood that when he died, they'd planned to do the same to him, to take him apart, to add him to their database, to ensure that even his death served their research purposes. That's why I had to escape, he said. Not just because captivity was unbearable, but because I couldn't let them have my body. Couldn't let them add me to that collection. Couldn't let my death become more data justifying more captures of my people. Had to die free. Had to die where they couldn't find me. Had to make sure my body went back to the earth the way it's supposed to, not into a freezer in some government facility. He also told us about the living ones, the ones still in captivity when he escaped. He didn't know if they were still alive. After 18 years, probably not. But when he left, there were at least 3 others he knew of, could hear their voices, could identify them as distinct individuals even without seeing them. One older individual who'd been there longer than Kahatsi. 2 younger ones, captured more recently, still fighting captivity with aggression rather than adaptation. I think about them every day, he said. Feel guilty for escaping when they couldn't. Guilty for being free while they're still there. Still suffering, still being used. But I couldn't save them, couldn't free them, barely freed myself. All I could do was survive, bear witness, tell someone what happens, hope that someday someone might care enough to stop it. We asked him if he thought telling his story would help his people, if exposure might force the government to shut down the program. He didn't think so. Thought the classification was too strong, the compartmentalization too effective, the public too willing to prioritize national security over the rights of non-human intelligence. Thought at best we'd be dismissed as crazy. At worst, we'd be targeted for revealing classified information. But tell anyway, he said, when the time is right. When you're old enough that threats don't matter. When you're dying and they can't hurt you, tell someone. Make sure the truth exists somewhere outside classified files. Make sure someone knows what the government does to beings they don't legally recognize. Maybe it won't change anything. Probably won't. But truth matters. Testimony matters. Witnessing matters, even if no one listens. His last words were in his own language. Our people who sat with him at the end didn't understand the words but understood the meaning. He was saying goodbye to his family, to his people, to everyone he'd lost during 11 years in captivity, apologizing for failing to protect them, asking forgiveness for escaping when they couldn't, promising to wait for them in whatever comes after death. Then he was gone, and we sat with his body for a day and a night, honoring him in silence, preparing him for burial according to the traditions he'd described. And then we took him to a place so remote, so hidden, so secret, that I won't describe it even now. We buried him deep, covered the site so thoroughly that within weeks, nature had erased all evidence of disturbance, made him disappear. The government never found him. We made sure of that. He died free. That's something. Not much, but something. 18 years have passed since Kahatsi died. 18 years during which our tribe has lived with this knowledge, this burden, this terrible understanding of what our government does to intelligent beings it doesn't recognize as persons. We've watched, waited, protected the secret as he asked us to. But we've also witnessed things that confirm his story. Things that prove the program is real, is ongoing, is expanding. In 2009, 3 years after Kahatsi's death, we saw helicopters, military helicopters, circling our territory, using equipment we recognized as thermal imaging, searching. We knew what they were searching for, either Kahatsi's body or other members of his species. We kept quiet, kept our people inside, avoided giving them any reason to investigate our reservation more closely. They circled for 3 days, then left. Came back twice more that year, then stopped. Either they concluded he'd died somewhere outside our territory, or they'd given up. But the message was clear. They were still looking, still operating, still hunting his people. In 2013, we noticed increased federal presence in the area. Not obvious, not overt. But we've learned to recognize the signs. Unmarked vehicles, personnel who claim to be doing wildlife surveys but have military bearing, restricted areas established with flimsy justification. They were active, searching. Maybe they'd had another sighting. Maybe they were following leads. We warned the beings we knew were still in our territory, left traditional markers, signs that meant danger, signs that said, hide deeper. In 2017, one of our hunters found a capture site, a clearing in deep forest that had been torn up. Trees broken, ground disturbed, blood. Lots of blood. And tracks. Large tracks leading to the site. No tracks leading away except human boot prints and vehicle tracks. They'd caught someone. Had taken them. We held ceremony for whoever it was. Someone's family member. Someone's friend. Someone who was now in a facility like the one Kahatsi described. Experiencing the same captivity. The same research. The same suffering. And we couldn't do anything except mourn and remember and carry the guilt of knowledge without power. These incidents aren't coincidences. They're evidence that Project Nightfall, or whatever it's called now, is still operational, still capturing his people, still studying them, still treating intelligent beings as government property, still operating with full legal immunity because the subjects of their research aren't legally protected, and still hidden behind classification that prevents oversight, investigation, or accountability. I'm telling this story now because I'm dying. Liver failure, maybe 2 months left, and because the political climate has changed in ways that make me fear what comes next. I've watched this country become more authoritarian, more willing to sacrifice rights for security, more willing to dehumanize others, more willing to justify cruelty in the name of national interest. What they do to Kahatsi's people, they do to humans too, to immigrants in detention, to prisoners in black sites, to anyone classified as other, as threat, as undeserving of basic human rights. The program that captured and tortured Kahatsi isn't an aberration. It's a template. It's proof of what happens when government operates without accountability, when classification prevents transparency, when beings are declared non-persons and therefore exempt from rights. What happens to Bigfoot today could happen to any marginalized group tomorrow. The infrastructure exists. The legal frameworks exist. The willingness to cause suffering for perceived national benefit exists. That's why this story matters. Not just because Kahatsi and his people deserve to be remembered, not just because the truth deserves to be told, but because this program reveals something fundamental about government power and the dangers of secrecy, about what happens when we allow classification to hide atrocities, about what happens when we accept that some beings don't count as persons and therefore can be treated however the state deems necessary. I know what I'm risking by telling this. My tribe could face retaliation, could lose federal funding, could have our sovereignty challenged, could be investigated for harboring classified information. Individual members could be targeted. I could be arrested for revealing classified information, though I never signed NDAs, never agreed to classification, never worked for the government. I'm simply a witness telling what I witnessed. But that might not protect me, might not protect my people. But I'm old, dying, beyond threats, and I've decided that protecting my people means exposing what threatens all of us. The program that captured Kahatsi will continue as long as it stays secret. We'll continue capturing his people. We'll continue treating them as research subjects. We'll continue operating with impunity. The only hope, slim but real, is exposure. Is enough people knowing that the political cost of continuing becomes too high? Is public pressure forcing oversight? Is moral outrage forcing change? I don't have proof. Can't provide photos or documents. Everything Kahatsi told us exists only in memory, in oral testimony, in stories we've passed among ourselves. The government will deny everything. We'll say this is fabrication, delusion, indigenous mythology being presented as fact. They'll discredit me, discredit my tribe, discredit this testimony. That's what they do. That's what they're good at. But some people will listen. Some people will recognize truth even without documentation. Some people will understand that governments do hide horrible things behind classification, do commit atrocities they later deny, do treat vulnerable populations in ways that history eventually judges as evil. Those people need to hear this, need to know what their government does, need to demand accountability. To Kahatsi's people, wherever you are, whoever survives, we tried to protect your brother, tried to honor his memory, tried to keep your secret. But I've decided that exposure is better than silence. That maybe possibly telling this story creates enough pressure that the program becomes unsustainable. That maybe your best protection is public awareness rather than secrecy. I hope I'm right. I hope this helps you. I hope I haven't made things worse. To my people, my tribe, I'm sorry for the trouble this may bring. Sorry for breaking silence we agreed to keep. But I'm old and dying, and I've decided some truths are worth the cost. You'll understand or you won't. You'll forgive me or you won't. Either way, it's done. To whoever's reading this, whoever hears this testimony, a being named Kahatsi died on our reservation in 2006. He told us about 11 years in government captivity, about a program that captures and studies his people, about facilities that hold intelligent beings without rights, without protection, without oversight. He told us horrifying things about what the US government does to beings it doesn't consider persons. Believe it or don't. Investigate or don't. Demand accountability or don't. But know this, Kahatsi was real. His suffering was real. The program is real, and it continues. That's my testimony. That's his story. That's the truth the government doesn't want you to know. I'm ready for whatever consequences come. I'm dying anyway. Can't take any threats away from me that cancer hasn't already taken. So I'm telling the truth while I still can, while my voice still works, while I can still honor the promise I made to a dying person who trusted my people when he had every reason not to trust any humans. Remember Kahatsi. Remember what was done to him. Remember what's still being done. And demand better. From your government. From yourselves. From all of us.